Developed and published by Bandai Namco in 2019 was that of Code Vein. Taking place in the unknown amount of years in the future from the present day, the world has collapsed due to an incident known only as the Great Collapse. Monsters have emerged due to the collapse, and in order to fight against the threat that they pose to humanity, technology created the Revenants, corpses of human beings who have been brought back to life by implanting a biological organ regenerative parasite, abbreviated as boar parasites, within the human heart, acting as an agent to help the individual live and fight once more for humanity. Revenants eventually helped humanity against the monsters brought about by the Great Collapse, but an unforeseen consequence of the boar parasites were later discovered, that revenants can only truly die if their hearts are destroyed, as well as requiring human blood to keep themselves sane, and if unable to consume human blood, they would enter a mental state called being frenzied, and eventually mutating into the Lost, cannibalistic creatures without any mind or control over their actions. Over time, the numbers of the Lost inevitably increase, and actually begin to pose more of a threat to humanity than the monsters caused by the Great Collapse. A mist that hastens the Revenant's decay into a Lost later emerges, which was called the miasma due to the massive amounts of Lost that now exist within the city only known as Vane, where the game takes place in. Due to events depicted in the game, the main protagonist has to help save the city of Vane, as well as the humans and Revenants within it. Code Vein was noted upon its release for being that of a highly character-driven game, with a good amount of details placed upon the characters that the main protagonist interacted with, and their reasons for joining the protagonist on their quest to save humanity, as well as their fellow Revenants. All of the characters all had complex sub-stories, and even the secondary based characters also had in-depth sub-stories for the player to learn about and experience. These sub-stories were called memories, in which the player could learn about the lore and details pertaining to the said character. Despite the positive aspects of the game, it was considered to be what was known as a Souls-like game. Comparisons were inevitably made, and criticisms of it were due in part to these preferences from players. The character-driven details that emphasized the reasons why the supporting characters fought or lore associated with them were actually one of the reasons why some gamers didn't exactly enjoy the experience of Code Vein. Some thought the lore of the characters to be ironically too complex, and took away from the overall experience of the game, which, according to some details on situations depicted or not depicted in the game, were somewhat vague, as abilities or attacks were defaulted to be basic, again with emphasis on character interactions, that actually unlocked abilities or attacks associated with characters were defaulted to be basic, again with emphasis on character interactions that would actually unlock more attacks or more abilities to be selectable for players to use during gameplay. What exactly caused the Great Collapse and how society was before the Great Collapse weren't depicted nor mentioned within the game's story. The main protagonist that the player assumed throughout the story had nearly no dialogue, so it was assumed that the deep character lore would help the player to understand details or circumstances for the game. But for casual players, it actually took away from the experience of playing the game. Dungeon layouts and dynamics of the game were also neutral for gamers, with some having the fighting mechanics of the game being too simple, unlocking more depth associated with the Souls-like details from other games. All of these details later had the game to be somewhat neutral in terms of a reception from players or gamers for Bandai Namco. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because a video game depicted nearly all characters with rich and highly complex lore for players to learn about, but ironically the details of the characters were too much for some to care about or even understand.